To say Kingdom Hearts 3 is a divisive game to its community would be the understatement of the year. Though a year later with the release of Kingdom Hearts 3 Remind, it would provide the additions and clarity that the fanbase desired from the initial release of the game. However, of course, this release of Remind still brought about its own issues, but those are not the topic of this video. One of the biggest flaws that many fans claim to exist in Kingdom Hearts 3 is the apparent structural and pacing issues for the game's narrative. Many of the most important scenes are shoved towards the end of the game, the structure of boss fights in the conclusion distracted from the traditional build-up of Kingdom Hearts boss fights, which to many made the fights unmemorable, which in turn is a flaw to many when this is supposed to be the conclusion of a saga in a story. However, of course, these are all subjective points of view, so don't take any of these things as definitive facts. But with this essay, I want to point towards the facts that exist within the game itself and analyze the objective that Kingdom Hearts 3 is trying to accomplish. But before we get started, I want to thank the lovely people who support me on Patreon. Those who do get access to exclusive polls that decide what videos come out, what live stream series we do, and access to videos early. So much love to everybody you see on screen here for supporting me. But with that, this is our look under the lens at Kingdom Hearts 3's structural crisis. It's quite obvious that the surface level objective for Kingdom Hearts 3's plot is for Sora to regain the powers he lost because of the events of Kingdom Hearts Dream Drop Distance, while everyone attempts to discover the whereabouts of the lost Keyblade wielders of Birth by Sleep. And when looking at the plot of this game, the primary reason something that seems so simple feels underwhelming is because our main character that we control in Kingdom Hearts 3 is someone who wasn't fully involved in the discovery of these people for a majority of the game. We essentially were treading steps we've already taken in previous games. We didn't adventure to regain our powers in those games because we developed them initially while having a different mission back then. It also feels hard for the player to fully grasp the true reasoning what we're even doing in Kingdom Hearts 3 for two more reasons. One, from a gameplay perspective, Sora is more agile and competent in battle than he's ever been before, primarily because this game being the newest in the series at the time, so having him go backwards in terms of combat capabilities for a new game would only spell disappointment to fans, even if it complemented the story's reason for it. And before leaving a comment about it, when I say Sora is most competent in Kingdom Hearts 3, I mean that over its competitor KH2, mainly because despite some people preferring Sora mechanically in that game, from a more broad yet general perspective, Sora is capable of doing much more in this game. Now, the other reasoning is that KH3's story is broken up to where different people are assigned different roles. Riku and Mickey are tasked with finding the lost Keyblade wielders of Birth by Sleep. Leah and Kairi are training in the way of the Keyblade to at least be somewhat competent in the fight against the darkness at the end of the game. The Lab Coat boys are doing lab coat things, all while Sora, Donald, and Goofy are just going on adventures to get Sora's power back. Did you spot the strange point here? Kingdom Hearts 3 has a ton of plot to cover. However, they leave the most interesting and important tasks to characters we don't play 98% of this game as. It leaves us, the players who experience this game as Sora, constantly wondering what the others are up to and what is it we're even doing here. We know we've got to get our powers back, but again, it's hard to translate that message when the gameplay and story are telling us two totally different things. And yes, I know the story flashes to other teams to show us what they're doing, but honestly, their briefness and occurrences in the game seem more like a way to tell the players, hey, yeah, we haven't forgotten these guys, they're still around, which I appreciate, but if they were going to divide what needed to be done into roles for different teams, we should have been able to play a version of the story for those moments. And yes, I know Riku every once in a while we were able to play as, but this is not what most wanted, nor was it what I feel we needed. They also litter scenes with the organization throughout the game on Sora's side of things, but because Sora is so out of the loop, it kind of makes us feel what he's feeling. And I want to make that clear that when I'm talking about the pacing, I'm not counting this as an objective flaw or anything. The intention was for Sora to feel this way, and in turn have us feel similarly. But just because the game achieved what it set out to do in this particular instance does not make what it was aiming for something fully enjoyable. But going back, it makes seeing Marluxia and Larxene only feel satisfying because it's a good callback to Rechain of Memories, and because of what we learned more of their past lives back in Kingdom Hearts Union Cross. So seeing in general that they're tied to the plot again feels good. Despite that we're up against the true Organization 13 this time, we were expecting a similar style of how KH2 went about taking down this same organization. But instead, we just fought battles with multiple enemies with our multiple allies. It took the seriousness and immersion out of what Kingdom Hearts is known for when it comes to boss fights. Though, like I said earlier, this was rectified with the release of Kingdom Hearts 3 Remind DLC, though I'd still argue, yes, I'm able to fight much more challenging versions of these people one-on-one, but these aren't story battles. The build-up you get from the story to then lead into a fight is some of the best parts of JRPGs, so having to retreat to DLC to get what we wanted is just a disappointment. Speaking of the DLC though, let's cover a point I want to bring up about the Remind scenario. I'm very glad we got this DLC, as it answered a ton of questions and reworked things to be more accessible and enjoyable for most players, like the option to play as the other characters you fight alongside in the in-game boss fights, though only some of them. However, the story of the scenario, I feel half of it could have been included in the main story, but I feel as well as having to keep up with two different versions of Sora would have been complicated to explain for the average player, making this segment of the game where so much plot is dumped onto you already was even harder to retain in the end. So I call it a flaw, but I feel putting what they did in Remind as DLC was the best course of action in my eyes. Though I can't say the same for the Limit Cut or Secret scenarios because this was just an epilogue to KH3. It's been a year since Sora disappeared, but not much is said despite having an in-game reason why Sid put more work in the post-game content than Square did. I feel there's zero reason to not have had this in the main game. It does not affect the main story negatively since it takes place afterwards and would still include Sora versus Yozora's fight and the info that came with it. It would have given us the same clarity we got just earlier. Though with all those negatives out of the way, you're probably convinced I don't like this game or something. But that couldn't be any further from the truth, because despite looking under the lens and seeing this game for what it is and trying to achieve, I feel that I still enjoy what I've played and replayed. The game has some of the best implemented stories in Disney worlds in the whole series next to Days. Not all of them are winners, but I feel the positives outweigh the negatives here. I like how they structured the story with the worlds, that they give us a bit of the overall narrative in between each world. Yes, they wouldn't always be from Sora's point of view, but giving the player a little bit of insight, even if it's just to keep us in the know just a bit more than Sora, is something I'm eternally grateful for. The worlds are bigger than they've ever been, and the story of each world properly reflect that. The story of Pirates goes well with all the different areas you can explore on the surface and beneath the water. It complements the complexities that come with the world of Pirates. Leading up to the fight with Davy Jones, all of it benefited from the world structure being the way it was, allowing for an extremely immersive experience. This world absolutely achieved what it was aiming for. Though I could say the same for Tangled, though personally I have the issue that a vital story element from the movie was left out from the game's version. I can forgive it because it doesn't really affect the end result in the slightest, and the main characters weren't there to witness the mistake or even to question it. I can also forgive it because, man, I love Tangled. The story is heartwarming and it's just fun to see Rapunzel's reaction to her leaving her tower for the first time. And to put yourself in her shoes, well, if she wore any, the world outside your tower would be bigger than imagination allows, and the world design reflects this by having the world be enormous. There are numerous different ways to go, so many different vegetation too. It's cool to see this forest in such an enormous way that it almost felt real. Exploring it allowed us to let loose like we were kids on the playground, and this translated well by how the characters seem like they're just having fun, making memories, gaining experiences. Sure, there were monsters, but with our friends by our side, there was nothing to fear, and you can see that through the characters inside and outside of battle. I'm only putting this in because I know half the comments will be about it, but yes, I agree. The Frozen world was a bit of a low point. Yes, there are tons of theories with tons of weight that could explain why it was set up like this, but for this particular video, I'll only touch on how this world made me feel. Frozen's world was not the greatest for obvious reasons, but honestly, exploring a winter wonderland was breathtaking. I could go without having to climb this stupid mountain like 3 times as a part of the narrative here, but I found it to be enjoyable from a gameplay standpoint. In some aspects though, again, I hated feeling like I was retreading things. I didn't like how hardly any narrative of Frozen's movie was presented here. I also don't like how the main plot felt even more disconnected than usual in a Disney world, despite Larxene giving us a bit of info at the very beginning, then just going away. The world was fun, but I sadly felt the cons outweighed the pros on this one. But if I'm honest, I've kinda got off topic here. This video isn't a review of Kingdom Hearts 3. It's more of an analysis of the structure and pacing of the game. I wanted to set out and see if Kingdom Hearts 3 achieved what it was trying to accomplish. So with that, I did bring up a few Disney worlds, primarily as a point to show how the narrative handles something the player has to go through in order to fully digest the overall narrative. I feel most people don't have an issue with how Kingdom Hearts 3 handles its story really until the ending. The way it tries to conclude the stories of multiple trios made people feel we didn't have enough time with each of them to feel satisfied. And in a way, I gotta agree with this. I didn't really want to leave when Roxas, Lee, and Xion finally reunited. I wanted to hear them catch up and see how they felt. Though I know the situation wasn't exactly ideal and I understand that, it honestly makes it more realistic. But the fact that each trio stays behind and just tells Sora they'll catch up later makes me wish I could stay behind here too and hear the talks they have before leaving to going and meet up back with Sora. And we don't even get this before the game ends, as after it's all over, it just shows them all having fun on the beach, already happy to have been reunited. Talks concluded with the fun already begun. It's beautiful for sure, but I can't help but want more. When I say the in-game narrative wasn't perfect, it's how they handled these arcs concluding and the boss fights from a gameplay perspective. Though I find myself able to forgive the triple Xehanort fight, I think the game handled that fight well, as individually they've all failed, so tackling things together this time makes sense. I'm also okay with the final Xehanort fight and the conclusion of the final battle as well. I'm aware that some feel that Xehanort's character arc ended on a not so great note, but honestly I just don't see it. He lost, again and again and again, even with his old friend telling him to essentially give it up. After a decade of planning and his execution failing with no more cards up his sleeve, what else was he supposed to do? I feel you can see him as an old man, you can really just sense the fatigue he's accumulated after all this time. I don't think he really regrets what he did in the end, but I think he respected the people who bested him. Sure, these stories can be left up to interpretation, but that's how I personally analyze it. So does Kingdom Hearts 3 achieve what it sets out to do? I totally think it does. Kingdom Hearts 3 from conception set out to conclude the Xehanort saga, and though some may say Melody and Memory does that, I personally feel that mainly as a recap game, I don't really think so. And the new scenes that were in it set up the next game and the entirety of Phase 2. KH3 might not have been what every fan wanted, but the game still reviewed positively and sold very well. So that's something we have to keep in mind, because social media places like Twitter is good at twisting your mind into thinking that that vocal minority you keep hearing is how the majority thinks, which is simply not the case. While taking a close look under the lens, Kingdom Hearts 3 is a fantastic game, totally worth the praise it's gotten. It's not perfect by any means, but I never expected it to be. And if you did, well, I hope you adjust your expectations for video game releases in the future. Nothing is perfect, so at least learn to take a closer look under the lens at what a game is trying to accomplish and see if it does so. And of course, you're still perfectly able to dislike something being fully aware of its objectives, even if it succeeds in accomplishing them. But if you enjoyed this video, let me know down in the comments below. Did you enjoy Kingdom Hearts 3? And what did you think of the game's structure? Again, please let me know. Once again, a huge thank you to my patrons for allowing this video to be possible. I appreciate your extended kindness. And if any of you watching this want to support me further than liking the video and subscribing, my Patreon will always be in the description below, as well as the pinned comment. Thank you all so much for watching. My name is KingdomAce, and remember my warriors of courage to stay strong, stay beautiful, and always look skyward.